The year was 1945, and winter still clung stubbornly to the ruins of Europe. Snow fell in dirty sheets over rail yards and roads ripped apart by retreating armies, and the air smelled of coal smoke and unwashed humanity. Germany was dying, not with a sudden shot, but with a slow, grinding collapse. Cities lay gutted and blackened. Refugees trudged along highways that no longer belonged to them, clutching sacks of bread or nothing at all. Amid this ruin, a quiet exodus was happening, one the history books rarely pause to notice. Young women in tattered gray-green uniforms, their eyes hollow, their stomachs empty, walking out of a war they had once believed they served. Greta Weber had not imagined herself a soldier. She was 22, with hair the color of wheat and hands calloused from long days behind a field telephone. When she joined the Luftwaffe as a signals operator in 1943, the recruiter had promised clean work, far from the front. She would be the voice in a headset, not a fighter on a battlefield. For a while the war felt distant. She worked in an office filled with humming radios and the scent of coffee substitute, laughing with other girls about pilots they'd never meet. But as the Reich shrank and the Allies pushed closer, their work became frantic. Coded messages, desperate calls for reinforcements that never came, commanders barking orders that no longer made sense. By April 1945, Greta's unit was stationed near Kassel, a town reduced to rubble by Allied bombers. Nights were lit by the dull red glow of fires on the horizon. Rumors traveled faster than orders. The Americans were close, the front was breaking, Hitler was hiding in Berlin, maybe dead already. Greta wrote home to her mother, a letter she would never know if anyone received, and packed a small satchel, a scarf, a photograph of her father in his Great War uniform, a crust of bread. She told herself it would only be a few days before things stabilized. Secretly, she feared they never would. She was not alone. All across Germany, hundreds of thousands of young women served as Helferinnen, auxiliaries to the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS. Some were clerks and typists, others operated searchlights or anti-aircraft guns. They were not supposed to fight, but war had a way of ignoring official designations. As the fronts collapsed, they were swept into retreat columns, abandoned by units that no longer had the strength to protect them. Records show that by the war's end, over 500,000 women had worn some form of German military uniform. Few imagined they might one day be counted as prisoners of war. The night the Americans came, Greta and the other girls were ordered to destroy files. They fed papers into a stove until the flames roared and smoke stung their eyes. Sometime before dawn, the officers vanished. No farewell. No plan. Just gone. By morning, a column of Sherman tanks rolled down the road, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Greta stood with her hands up, shaking so badly she nearly dropped the little satchel she carried. Around her the other women did the same, some crying, some too numb to react. The Americans shouted orders in a language most of them barely understood. A few men, older clerks who had lingered, tried to speak. They were shoved aside and made to sit in the mud. Greta expected to be shot. She had been told since childhood that enemies, Russians, Americans, whoever, would show no mercy. Instead, the soldiers searched her quickly, pulling the Luftwaffe eagle from her collar, tossing it into the snow. One of them took her bread crust and sniffed at it, then tossed it back with a strange, almost embarrassed look. They herded the women into a group, gesturing toward trucks. There was no brutality but no kindness either. Just efficiency, as though they were moving livestock. Greta climbed onto the bed of a truck and sat among strangers, the engine jolting to life beneath her. Lotte Adler, a dark-haired teleprinter clerk, sat opposite Greta on that ride. Lotte had joined the army because it promised escape from a dull village life. She liked the crisp lines of the uniform, the idea of doing something important. Now she stared at the American soldiers riding behind them, fingers clenched around her knees. She whispered to Greta in a voice that trembled more from cold than fear, "They don't look like monsters." Greta nodded but said nothing. The truck lurched on. Their destination was not a proper camp, just a fenced field near a captured airstrip. Barbed wire gleamed under a gray sky, and the ground was slick with mud and melted snow. A few canvas tents flapped in the wind, but there were no bunks, no stoves, no food in sight. The guards, young men in olive drab, looked almost as weary as their captives. They pointed the women toward a corner of the field. A translator with halting German announced that they would be processed and sent west. No one explained what that meant. The first day passed in a haze of cold and hunger. Greta huddled with Lotte and a few others, trading fragments of bread and news. One girl sobbed until she had no tears left. Another muttered prayers. Night fell early, bringing a hard frost that bit through their thin coats. Somewhere an engine coughed to life then died. The guards smoked and laughed in low voices, but otherwise ignored them. Greta tried to sleep sitting upright, shivering violently. She thought of home, of her mother's kitchen, and of how she had imagined surrender would mean safety. Instead, it meant waiting in the mud, stomach empty, future unknown. Over the next days, more prisoners arrived, men mostly gaunt and hollow-eyed. They were kept separate, though sometimes Greta caught glimpses, columns of Wehrmacht soldiers stumbling under the weight of their own exhaustion. The Americans seemed overwhelmed. Trucks came and went, guards were rotated out. Food arrived sporadically, a thin soup one day, hard biscuits the next, sometimes nothing at all. The women learned to scavenge, to beg quietly at the fence when a guard passed close. Some GIs shared a cigarette or a crust of bread. Others looked away, unwilling or unable to help. One evening, a young American private, barely older than Greta herself, stopped by the fence where she sat. His face was pale beneath a steel helmet, his uniform dusty. He hesitated, then knelt to pass a tin cup of something steaming. "Soup," he said, the word clumsy but clear enough. Greta stared, startled. She wanted to thank him but lacked the English. Instead, she nodded, clutching the cup as though it were gold. The warmth filled her hands, then her belly. When she looked up, he was already walking away. That moment, small, almost ordinary, unsettled her more than the capture had. The enemy was supposed to be monstrous. Yet here was a boy who looked like the one she had danced with before the war, offering kindness where none was required. It made the world feel strange, unmoored. Lotte, watching, whispered, "Be careful. Kindness can cost you." Greta didn't know what she meant, not yet. Not all encounters were gentle. Another guard, broad-shouldered and grinning too wide, made a show of tossing scraps toward the women, laughing as they scrambled for them. His gaze lingered longer than it should have. When one girl turned away in disgust, he spat near her boots. Power hung in the cold air like a smell, invisible but undeniable. Greta began to understand what Lotte meant. By the end of that first week, the women were changed. The crisp confidence of their uniforms was gone, insignia torn off, hair matted, faces hollow. They spoke less, moved slower, learned to read the moods of their captors with silent precision. Survival meant watching, waiting, adapting. Some tried to stay invisible. Others, especially the bolder ones, sought favor, a smile here, a shared cigarette there. No one said it aloud, but the unspoken truth grew heavier each day. In this place, rules were thin and hunger was strong. One night, rain swept the camp, turning the ground into a slick of black mud. Greta lay awake under a soaked blanket, teeth chattering, when headlights cut across the field. A jeep stopped near the women's section. Two soldiers jumped out, one older, an officer by the look of his insignia. They spoke in English too quick to follow. Then the officer pointed, and a guard strode into the cluster of women, lantern swinging. He scanned faces as though choosing from a menu. His eyes landed on Greta. She froze as he beckoned. Lotte squeezed her hand briefly before letting go. Greta stood on shaking legs and followed, mud sucking at her boots. The officer looked her over, said something she couldn't understand, then waved her toward the jeep. She hesitated. The guard's hand tightened on her arm, firm but not brutal. The engine roared. She was driven out past the wire, past the floodlights, into the dark. She didn't know where they were going or why. Her heart hammered so hard she could barely breathe. The officer didn't look at her. He spoke quietly with the driver. The road was lined with bombed-out houses, shadows flickering in the headlights. Greta thought of escape, but the night and the foreign land swallowed the idea before it formed. After what felt like forever, the jeep stopped near a farmhouse commandeered as a command post. The officer stepped out and motioned for her to follow. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and coffee. A small stove hissed. Maps covered the walls, and an American flag hung behind a makeshift desk. The officer turned to her and, with careful slowness, said in accented German, "You work? Typing? Telephone?" Greta nodded, startled to understand. He gestured to a chair and a battered typewriter. Papers waited. Orders, reports, she couldn't tell. He pointed to himself and said, "Captain Miller." Then, softer, almost an afterthought, "Safe here. Safe." The word landed like a stone in water, rippling outward. Greta sat, hands trembling as she touched the keys. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but the room was warm and the stove smelled faintly of food. The captain poured something dark into a mug and set it beside her. She didn't drink, not yet. She looked at him, at the foreign uniform, at the gun on his belt. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away, already buried in paperwork. For the first time since surrendering, she felt something like breath return to her lungs. But safety was never simple in 1945. Behind the warmth lurked uncertainty, the kind born when power tilts and one life depends quietly on another's will. Greta knew this even as she sat at the typewriter, fingers hesitating above the keys. The captain hadn't said much, but his meaning had been clear enough. Here she would work. Here she would eat. Here she belonged to the victors now. Outside, the camp shivered in the cold, unaware that one of its prisoners had just stepped into a new kind of captivity, one shaped not by barbed wire but by survival itself. Rain turned the camp into a bog of black sludge by the second week. Every step sucked at boots until soles tore free, and the smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the air. Greta rose each morning from a damp blanket with a back so stiff it felt broken. Across the wire, the American guards smoked and shifted their weight from foot to foot, their faces drawn but dry under slick ponchos. Hunger had become a creature that lived inside her now, gnawing slow and merciless. Soup came rarely, a thin gray broth with floating scraps of potato or nothing at all. Some days there was only a biscuit hard enough to crack a tooth. On the worst days there was nothing but hope and the ache of emptiness. Lotte tried to keep a kind of order. She spoke quietly to the younger girls, coaxing them to share scraps and water, dividing the few cigarettes a sympathetic soldier had slipped through the fence. "If you stop talking, you stop living," she told Greta one morning, her lips pale and cracked. But even Lotte's voice sometimes faltered. Once, after a night of bitter rain, she stared out across the field with hollow eyes and whispered, "I dreamed of bread. Fresh white bread. I woke up crying." The Americans seemed overwhelmed by their own victory. Trains arrived daily with more prisoners, men mostly, Wehrmacht and SS soldiers who stumbled from boxcars like ghosts. The guards grew harsher as the numbers swelled. Rations were stretched thin, trucks carrying supplies often passed without stopping. There were rules, technically. The Geneva Conventions hung like a ghost over every military post, but reality ignored them. The U.S. Army had expected captives, yes, but not rivers of them, not hundreds of thousands surrendering at once. Logistics collapsed. People went hungry. Some died quietly, curled in the mud before dawn. Greta saw her first corpse 3 days after the rain began. A man, young, blond, his hands still curled around an empty mess tin, lay near the fence. No one touched him for hours until a guard finally dragged the body away by the shoulders. No ceremony, no words. Just disappearance. The sight hollowed Greta further than hunger ever could. Death was no longer a distant thunder. It was here, silent and casual. Inside the farmhouse, Greta's world looked different but felt no less precarious. Captain Miller, with his tired eyes and quiet voice, had given her a space in the corner near the stove and set her to typing reports. Lists of captured material, notes on troop movements, endless paperwork that seemed to sprout like weeds. The warmth saved her skin. The food, black coffee, tinned meat, sometimes even butter, saved her body. But the salvation came at a price she could not name. She was not free. She belonged to this strange little pocket of order, and its survival was tied to the captain's unspoken permission. Miller himself remained a puzzle. He was courteous but distant, neither cruel nor warm. Sometimes he tried a few German words, Gut, Arbeiten, Essen, but mostly he left her alone. Only once did he ask about her life before. "Family?" She answered softly, "Mutter." He nodded, then returned to his maps. Yet his gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't looking, not with menace but with the heavy recognition of one human watching another balance on the edge. Lotte was not so lucky. She remained in the field with the others, skin thinning over sharp bones. When Greta smuggled her a crust of bread one night, Lotte clutched it to her chest as though it were treasure. "You're warm in there," she whispered, envy sharpening her voice before softening into gratitude. "Don't forget what it costs." Greta didn't answer. She didn't know the cost yet herself. But she felt it building, invisible, in the way guards looked at her when she crossed back to the wire, in the way Miller's staff fell silent when she entered a room. She was useful now, and usefulness in war could be both shield and leash. As days stretched into weeks, survival became a craft. The women learned to barter. A cigarette for a scrap of bread, a translation for a sip of coffee. Some risked flirting with guards. Others kept eyes down and prayed not to be noticed. A few vanished overnight, taken for questioning or labor, and never returned. Rumors whispered of worse fates beyond the camp. Assault, trafficking, Soviet reprisals further east. Fear was a constant, but so was a hardening resilience. Greta felt herself changing, hunger sharpening her senses, danger teaching her to read every glance, every shift in a soldier's voice. One evening, a jeep screeched to a stop at the edge of the field. An American sergeant jumped down and barked names from a crumpled list. Greta froze when she heard lattes. Her friend stepped forward, chin high though she trembled. Greta moved without thinking, crossing to the fence. "Where are you taking her?" she called in halting English. The sergeant didn't answer. He just waved her back with a dismissive hand. Latte looked at Greta once, a brief, fierce glance, then climbed into the jeep. The taillights vanished into rain and darkness. Greta never saw her again. That night, Greta couldn't sleep. She sat by the stove in the farmhouse, staring at the typewriter keys, fingers numb though the room was warm. Miller entered quietly, carrying a mug. He paused, studying her face. "Your friend?" he asked softly. She swallowed hard and nodded. He hesitated, then said, "Not bad place. Work." The words were awkward, but something in his eyes told her even he wasn't certain. He set the mug down beside her, hot broth, fragrant and rich, then left without another word. The broth scalded Greta's tongue, but she drank it anyway, tears running silently down her face. She hated him then, hated the ease with which he could decide fates, the gulf between his power and her helplessness. Yet she also knew the hate was tangled with gratitude, with the raw instinct to live. War made contradictions of everyone. By mid-May the camp thinned. Trucks carried groups of prisoners westward, toward more permanent camps in France or occupied Germany. The women counted days, names, rumors. Greta stayed in the farmhouse, each departure tightening the invisible thread that bound her to Miller's world. She learned small things about him, that he missed his home in Iowa, that he'd once taught history before the draft, but never anything that explained why he'd taken her in. Protection? Convenience? Something lonelier? She couldn't tell. He never touched her, never threatened. Yet each day she remained, the truth settled deeper. She was safe only because he allowed it. One morning, after a night of sharp frost that left the field glittering cruelly under the dawn, Miller called her from the typewriter. His face was drawn, his voice quiet. "Today, moving camp," he said. "Many go." She felt her chest seize, fear that he meant her too. But then he shook his head. "You stay. Work here. Safer." He didn't explain. He didn't have to. The offer, command really, was both reprieve and prison. Greta stepped outside and saw the departing column. Women and men climbing into trucks, faces blank with exhaustion, bound for unknown fates. She stood by the doorway as the engines roared, feeling their eyes on her, some envious, some accusing. She wanted to run after them, to refuse this strange sanctuary. But hunger and terror held her still. Safety was a cage she couldn't afford to leave. When the trucks vanished into the distance, the camp seemed emptier, quieter, but no less tense. A single guard remained by the fence, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. She turned back inside, her hands trembling though the room was warm. Miller was at the desk, head bent over a map. Without looking up, he said in English barely above a whisper, "War is almost over." Then after a beat, he added words that made her blood go cold. "But for you, not yet." Greta stood frozen, the echo of his voice heavy in the air. Outside, the rain began again, soft and relentless. The war beyond the wire was ending, but inside this quiet, strange captivity, something more personal and dangerous was only beginning. Summer crept into the ruins with a quiet persistence, drying the mud to cracked earth and filling the air with the scent of warm dust and distant fires. The guns had fallen mostly silent. Newspapers in Allied hands declared victory. Banners in faraway cities celebrated peace. Yet for Greta, peace felt like a word whispered through glass, present but unreachable. She was alive, yes. Fed, clothed, kept from the brutal chaos beyond the wire. But safety here was not freedom. It was an arrangement, fragile and unnamed. Captain Miller changed with the season. In May he had been tense, watchful, a man still half in battle. By June a slower weariness replaced that edge. He stopped wearing his sidearm indoors. He smiled more, though the smiles were small and tired. Sometimes he spoke without meaning to, little fragments of memory. Baseball games, a sister in Chicago, the smell of cornfields after rain. Greta listened, answering carefully when she could, her English improving in hesitant steps. He never asked about her war work, she never volunteered. Silence was safer than the truth. Yet silence could not hide the strange intimacy of proximity. She typed his reports, fetched maps, cleaned the stove. He left food where she could find it, an apple, a slice of bread still warm from some unseen kitchen. At first she took them with gratitude that burned her cheeks. Later she took them with a wary acceptance. The balance between them was clear. He commanded, she endured. But inside that imbalance flickered something more complex, a current neither seemed to know how to name. Greta felt it most in the small hours, when the farmhouse was quiet except for the hum of insects and the soft clatter of typewriter keys. She would glance up and find him watching her, not with cruelty but with a searching loneliness. Sometimes his eyes held the same hunger she felt, not for food but for contact, for a reminder that they were still human beings. That hunger frightened her more than hatred ever could. Hatred was simple. This was not. One evening he asked her to sit, not work. The sun had dropped behind broken barns, painting the room in bronze light. He poured coffee, added sugar, real sugar rare as gold, and slid the cup across. "You safe here?" he asked haltingly. Greta hesitated, unsure if it was a question or a warning. "Safer than outside," she said finally. He nodded, looking away, fingers drumming on the table. Then, softly, almost to himself, "War makes strange friends." She thought of Latte then, swallowed by some nameless convoy. She thought of the starving faces beyond the fence, of men who once shouted orders now begging for crusts. Strange friends indeed. The thought was bitter and tender all at once. Word drifted in from outside. Other camps were disbanding, prisoners shipped to France or sent trudging home. But here in this small outpost time stretched. Some guards packed to leave, others arrived fresh, restless and loud. One of them, a lanky corporal named Harris, took notice of Greta almost immediately. His German was clumsy but eager. He joked when she passed, offered cigarettes with a grin too wide to be harmless. Miller said nothing at first, only watched. But one evening when Harris lingered too long by her desk, Miller's voice cut through the air sharp as broken glass. "That's enough." Harris raised his hands, laughing it off, but the look Miller gave him was not a joke. After that, Greta understood something unspoken. She was under Miller's protection. And protection was its own kind of claim. It kept Harris at a wary distance, kept other men from testing boundaries. But it also wrapped chains around her she could not break. The kindness was real, the cage was real. Both existed at once. Sometimes she wondered what Miller wanted from her. He never touched her, never forced words or acts. Yet his gaze lingered, and his small gifts, bread, sugar, safety itself, felt weighted with expectation too subtle to name. Perhaps it was not desire in the usual sense but something lonelier, possession born of chaos, a man grasping for meaning in the wreckage. Still, possession it was. Greta adapted because there was no other choice. She smiled when he brought coffee, kept her posture modest but not hostile, thanked him for food in careful English. She learned to move in the narrow space between gratitude and survival, to accept what she needed without inviting more. Each day she balanced on that tightrope, knowing a single misstep, defiance, misunderstanding, refusal, could end her fragile sanctuary. Outside the farmhouse, Germany reeled under occupation. Villages burned quietly from retreating troops or vengeful reprisals. The Soviets advanced from the east, their reputation a shadow that terrified every woman in the camp. Refugees streamed westward in ragged lines, telling of looting, assault, and revenge. Even the Americans, officially bound to order, were not immune to chaos. Stories circulated of soldiers trading food for favors, of desperation twisting into exploitation. Greta listened to these rumors like someone feeling the edge of a knife, grateful for Miller's silent barrier even as it frightened her. The moment that crystallized everything came late one sweltering afternoon. Greta was typing as Miller spoke with two visiting officers, men she had never seen before, loud with easy victory. One of them noticed her, smirked, and said something in English that made the other laugh. Miller's shoulders stiffened. He replied curtly. The room went quiet, heat and tension colliding in the stale air. The officer grinned wider, reached out a hand as if to beckon her. In an instant Miller was on his feet, voice low but lethal. "Not yours." The silence that followed was absolute. The officer's smile faltered. After a beat he shrugged and turned away, muttering. Conversation stumbled back to logistics, but something fundamental had shifted. Greta kept typing, hands trembling. She felt the invisible claim tighten, protection and ownership braided into one. That night Miller did not speak. He poured himself a drink and stared at the wall until long after dark. Greta sat by the stove, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. She did neither. The unspoken hung heavier than any words could. When she finally lay down on the cot in the corner, sleep refused to come. She stared at the ceiling beams and thought of all the invisible bargains war demanded. Lotte's vanished face. Harris's hungry grin. Miller's quiet but absolute, "Not yours." Each choice bent around survival, dignity traded for safety, power cloaked in kindness. There were no clean lines left. Outside, crickets sang in the dark fields, a thin, fragile music against the silence of a world trying to remember peace. Inside, Greta understood with sudden clarity that she was safe only as long as Miller chose to guard that fragile line, and that his choice was its own form of captivity. The next morning he greeted her with quiet politeness as if nothing had changed. But when she sat at the typewriter and felt his watchful presence behind her, she knew the war might be over on paper, yet the battle for who owned her fate had only just begun. When the trucks finally came for the last prisoners, the air smelled of warm dust and diesel. It was August, the sky a thin, hard blue over a country still broken. Greta stood outside the farmhouse, clutching the satchel she had carried since surrender, worn leather, light enough now to feel almost weightless. The camp's wire had been taken down. The field where she once shivered in the mud was only bare ground. Victory had turned into administration. The U.S. Army was processing its human spoils, deciding who went where, who mattered, who could go home. Captain Miller walked beside her, slower than usual, hands tucked into the pockets of his faded uniform trousers. He looked older than he had in May, though the lines on his face had softened with the ending of war. "Transport west," he said quietly, his German still awkward but better than before. "You go now." Camp closed. His eyes searched hers for something, relief, gratitude, maybe even regret. Greta felt none of those clearly. Only the weightless numbness of a bird too long in a cage suddenly flung into sky. She wanted to ask why he had kept her. Why he had protected her, claimed her, but never crossed the line that others might have. Was it duty? Desire? Loneliness? But the words died on her tongue. Some answers could never be safely spoken. She nodded instead. "Danke," she said softly. "Thank you," and something else buried beneath it, unnameable. Miller's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked like he might say more. Then the officer returned, the soldier again, and he gave a single short nod. "Safe now," he murmured. It sounded less like a promise than a hope. The journey west was long and strange. Greta rode in a truck packed with other women, some who had known the camps, some who had survived worse. They were thinner, quieter, sharper than the girls who had once reported for duty in pressed uniforms. They spoke in fragments, trading stories that didn't quite add up. Nights of hunger, sudden kindness, betrayals and bargains. Lotte's name passed Greta's lips once, then faltered into silence when no one answered. The road was lined with ruins, scorched farms, skeletal cities, hollow-eyed civilians watching the convoys roll past. Germany was no longer a nation but a wound. When the trucks reached a processing station near the Rhine, the women were herded into tents. Interrogations followed. Names, units, questions about Nazi work. Greta told the truth where she dared and left silence where she must. The officers seemed exhausted, eager to move bodies on paper and in life. Within days she was released. No trial, no punishment, just a stamped document and permission to go home, though what home meant now was uncertain. She left with the clothes on her back and a ration packet pressed into her hands. Her village was half rubble when she returned. Her mother, miraculously alive, wept into her shoulder and would not ask where she had been. Neighbors stared but said little. In post-war Germany, silence was its own survival. Women who had worn uniforms were reminders of a shame no one wished to face. Greta learned quickly to hide her past. She said she had worked in communications, that she had been caught in the retreat. She did not mention the mud, the hunger, the barbed wire, and certainly not the farmhouse and the man who had decided whether she lived safely or starved. Yet his shadow lingered. At night she dreamed of the typewriter's clatter, the sharp scent of coffee and maps, the sound of his voice when he said, "Not yours." Sometimes she woke with gratitude. Other times with anger so fierce it shook her. He had saved her, yes, but on his terms. He had built her safety from his power. And she, starving and terrified, had accepted it. As months turned to years, Germany rebuilt, covering its scars with concrete and forgetfulness. Greta married a kind man who knew nothing of the war beyond his own boyhood hunger. She bore children and learned to smile at their school parades. But she never lost the private knowledge that safety could be a cage, that power dressed in kindness could still bind. Decades later, when the world began to ask questions about women in Hitler's war, when historians dug through forgotten diaries and archives, Greta remained silent. She burned the one letter she had once drafted to Miller but never sent. She did not want pity nor judgment. She wanted at last to own her own story, even if only in the quiet corners of her mind. Still, sometimes in the hush of night she saw again the day she left the farmhouse. The sun had been brutal, throwing hard shadows across the yard. Miller had stood with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing as the truck engine rattled to life. Their eyes had met for one brief, unguarded heartbeat, a look thick with all the things war twists between strangers. Need, power, survival, something like affection and nothing like freedom. Then the truck lurched forward and the moment was gone, swallowed by dust. Greta never saw him again. She did not know if he went home whole or broken, if he told anyone about the girl who had typed his reports in a borrowed language. She only knew that the quiet exchange between them had marked her more deeply than hunger or fear. It had taught her the most unsettling truth of all: wars do not end cleanly. They leave behind debts and bargains, invisible chains forged in the name of mercy. On the night Berlin's rubble finally sprouted street lamps again and children laughed in new-built squares, Greta sat by her window, older now, watching light spill where darkness had ruled. She thought of the whispered promises and unspoken claims that had kept her alive. She thought of how power wears many faces: brutal, tender, protective, possessive. And she understood, with a clarity that chilled her, that surviving had required surrender, but that surrender had been hers to remember, long after the world pretended the slate was clean. In that quiet, with the war long over and life rebuilt, she realized a final truth: freedom is not simply the absence of barbed wire. Sometimes it is the courage to remember who once held the key.